Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Wednesday, January the 17th, and this is the Ambient Weekly Contributors Meeting. So first off on the agenda, we have Sanjeev talking to us about Istio office hours.
Very quick. So I had created a sign-up sheet, but other than Howard, nobody has signed up yet. So I was having second thoughts about whether this is workable or not. So I had a brief chat with Howard, and he felt that it was probably still a good idea, but I would welcome the input of the community on this. And he indicated that maybe we can defer it by a week or two, but to gather more interest. But he thought it would still be useful to have at least the first one, and maybe others can, after they see the first one, they will be motivated to be the SMEs for follow-up ones. So um, I'm a little bit unsure right now about the office hours, but for now, there was supposed to be the first one was supposed to be tomorrow, but I've deferred it for now. But I would invite any input from the community, whether you guys think that it is genuinely useful or not. And if so, would appreciate more SMEs signing up. So any thoughts on whether we do believe that it is useful and we should have it? And if so, how can we generate a bit more interest?
Are you asking about interest from community members attending or SMEs hosting, or both?
Primarily the SMEs. I think if the SMEs take some time, then I think hopefully the communities will show up. I mean, but yeah, the question applies to both, but primarily the SMEs, because I didn't get any SMEs signing up yet, other than John. So
I can talk to folks within Microsoft, but I think that we would definitely like to have that as a goal for us to be able to participate as SMEs.
okay, so definitely please sign up in that case.
Sanjeev, can you just post the
yeah. Let me put the sign up sheet here again.
All right. So is that all for this topic? I take that as a yes. So next topic, I don't see it here, but Lynn, do you want to follow up on the annotations and labels? I think last week you said you want a community review offline and discuss it in this week's meeting.
Yeah, I can quickly run through. I think I got some feedback already, but I'm happy to run through if there's interest. So essentially, let me bring up the doc quickly. So essentially, I recently took a to-do to run through the labels and annotations in Sidecar to determine whether we need to support any of them in Ambient, because this was an Ambient blocking for beta item. So as part of that to-do, I essentially went through all the labels and annotations, and then try to categorize, does this make sense for Ambient? If it makes sense for Ambient, does it apply to Z-tunnel, or does it apply to the workload pods, or does it apply to the waypoints? So out of this exercise, I don't think I have anything that's major that would change the direction of whether we can go beta for any of these labels or annotations. The main reason is Ambient already supports some of these required label and annotations, such as the Sidecar injection label is continued to be useful in the Sidecar mode, even though user might already enable ambient, but if they're running in sidecar, this is still useful, and the revisionable will continue to be useful. It's still .io/rev. And then as far as annotation goes, a couple of, I actually need to remove a couple of annotation. I believe it's no longer used in Istio, so I will take a to-do to remove those. And there are, most of the annotation doesn't apply to ambient, and there are a few that's relevant to ambient, which I think are related to traffic, whether we should exclude or include certain ports in the IP range and interfaces. I believe I'm thinking it's not a beta blocker right now, because for zTunnel, it's not super common. User needs to exclude certain ports or interfaces, or include certain ports or interfaces, and we could potentially look into it after beta. The other to-do I have is I actually need to add how PO authentication, which also allow user to configure ports, would be related to here. So I have that to do on my mind since Friday last week. I just haven't had time to get to it. So that's the update. So if you disagree with my assessment on this exercise, do comment in the doc, or if you see any of these labels and annotation was not categorized properly, I certainly welcome feedback from folks. That's all, Francis. And yeah, and I want to shout out Ben, who helped me review it, and some of the other team members.
So unless we get any more community feedback, can we consider this issue closed and this doc sign off? I'm trying to determine what's the next step here.
Yeah, so I'm going to update the doc a little bit more on Friday's feedback around pure authentication policy, also has ports, and then I'll ask folks for approval.
Okay. All right, thank you, Lynn. That's that item there. Are there anything else from last week that we need to follow up on?
Yeah, so I saw Louis just joined. I don't know if Louis want to quickly talk about the policy status and also
Yeah.
policy. Yeah.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about it. So after some discussion among folks who've been kind of paying attention to the design, right, so initially we had that layer targeted auth Z policy where there would be an enum status to indicate where the policy would be implemented. Instead, after some thought, it seems what's most practical is instead of altering the API schema to control where the policy is implemented, and we've already done that to some degree by having workload selector and target ref, right, and following the gateway API spec. Instead, what we do is we codify the use of status on the authorization policy to report to users when a policy is targeted at a specific workload or gateway, what is the effective state of that policy. This approach more naturally aligns with the policy attachment specification in the gateway API, which we're trying to align with. And the auth Z policy is kind of a classic example of a policy that would attach to a context. And then we use status to communicate to users effective state, right? So if you attach an auth Z policy that has an L7 property to a workload, and that workload is being served by Ambient, then that specific auth Z policy rule obviously can't be implemented if we don't have L7 support in zTunnel, which we do not today. And so we would indicate that that rule would fail closed. And there's still some open debate about how exactly fail closed should occur. when it's bound in that context. When and if, let's say, some point down the road, the ability for a particular context expands to support more of the rule surface, then we can communicate the change in effective state by the same policy mechanism without altering the schema. And so it's a more flexible approach. It doesn't add any new schema, right? So we're not going to revise the API, although it does add schema to status, but that's not declarative schema. And it allows for the system to evolve without the API having to iterate. And so that seemed like a more practical solution. And if and when we have other concrete reasons to evolve the schema, we can do that. But right now, we don't really have a concrete reason to evolve the schema. That doesn't preclude Istio from supporting other policy-based APIs, let's say network policy, or if Gamma or Gateway API standardizes a different L7 policy object, those can also be supported by Istio. And very likely, because we would do those, we would follow the same conventions in terms of status support as codified by the Gateway API if it was a gateway attached policy, and or common convention for network policy if status there if we were to attach or to support binding or usage of network policy. So now the proposal is a much, right, obviously describing what we're going to put in the status, right? We have to do and document that. So I have an outline of that I'm getting some folks to review. But there's no concrete or declarative schema change to the Alt-C policy API. Costin.
Yeah, no, very good point. The Gateway API does have some pretty clear semantics around status, and we absolutely must support them because otherwise we cannot really be, gateway policy, and that will require some schema. And I think we kind of forgot about this to some extent. I mean, target ref obviously is a big deal, is the most important thing. My concern actually was really about our scalability and ability to support, the proper, tenancy model and other things. I mean, basically to make sure that the target ref that we support can be at route level, for example, so we don't have the interaction between different authorization policy attached to the waypoint or gateway that kind of step over each other and
Yes.
everything that we discussed in that document. That's probably more important than just saying blankly target ref can be a workload or can be a gateway, and then we are in the same boat that we are today. Okay,
so Sanjeev, just before, so one of the things that was discussed but I haven't yet addressed is the ability, because, and Costin's right, like we can attach authorization policy to other types. Right now, I'm just describing the ones in the doc that we know it has to attach to. But in particular, we did discuss whether it could attach to service, which is kind of a version of what you're discussing, Costin, right? Where you're attaching to a subset of the programmed functionality in the data path. And route would be another example of that. And route may make sense in the gateway case, right? When we do route-based partitioning of services as opposed to service or DNS-based partitioning of services. So I can add some commentary about that to the document, but I just haven't done that. Sanjeev?
Louis, I need to look at your doc. So I'm sorry if this was already covered in your doc, but one key area which I think is a kind of a gap is that, so we've got this thing about, okay, in some cases, the Kubernetes network policy will cover a certain requirement, but what about non-Kubernetes endpoints, right? Are we targeting the auth policy to be a full superset of Kubernetes network policy when the endpoint is not Kubernetes at all? Virtual machine.
The Istio Auth policy is not a strict superset of Kubernetes network policy.
Correct.
Nor was it ever intended to be. But it is intended to apply in every context where Istio is provided, right? So non-Kubernetes workloads. So
right, but
and that would
if we can rely on Kubernetes network policy to cover some requirement when the endpoint is Kubernetes? Are we just going to intentionally have a gap when because we would not have added that functionality into Istio L4 auth, assuming that that'll be covered by Kubernetes network policy, but then that doesn't handle the non-Kubernetes endpoints.
I think I don't know if Costin's going to say the same thing. The way Istio handles non-Kubernetes workloads is effectively by mapping them into Kubernetes workloads, right? Like the way we handle a VM is by saying a VM belongs to a namespace and looks a bit like a pod with these labels. That would allow us to implement at least a large subset of the Kubernetes network policy for that use case. I don't know exactly how much, right? And we'd have to go look at it, but I suspect the majority of it.
Sorry, Costin, before you just jump in, but for that, we would need the Kubernetes control plane to accept that policy for the non-Kubernetes endpoint to begin with.
No. So network policies are always written, right? They have an effective state that is dictated by the controller of the network policy, the network policy implementer. Right now, there's no codification of status on network policy, for instance, right? There's no specification for it in the Kubernetes API, so there are just conventions. If Istio is the implementer of Kubernetes network policy, then it will adopt its own conventions, try to align as well with what we consider industry best practice, but it will adopt conventions to indicate how it's handling that. That is not a Kubernetes facility at all, right? Network policy is just an interface. Kubernetes actually, other than specifying the API, says nothing else about it.
Right, so we would need a Istio controller that implements Kubernetes network policy for non-Kubernetes endpoints.
Yes.
And that's ambient. So that's the whole idea. I completely agree with Louis. I'm going to say exactly the same thing. We provide the infrastructure for non-Kubernetes environments to look like Kubernetes, basically labels. The policy is just an API that has nothing to do with Kubernetes, just a CRD representation of label-based firewalls, which is a general concept that everyone supports. And any implementation, Istio or others, would need to take into account the labels of the VMs or whatever they are, including remote Kubernetes clusters, which is a problem today with multi-cluster, even in Kubernetes, and correctly implements the network policy using the verifiable labels of the peer, which may be another Kubernetes cluster, maybe anything else. But from API perspective, the API just says that if it matches labels, allow. If it doesn't match its label, don't allow. Has nothing to do with environment or Kubernetes and Istio, Ambient, any other implementation will need to be consistent, and that's that's how things work.
Okay, I'm fine with that. I didn't want to rattle on that, but I just wondered whether that's covered in the doc, and I'll just look at the doc again.
So the doc specifically does not talk about Kubernetes network policy at all.
Mm-hmm.
Because Istio already handles non-Kubernetes workloads with auth-z policy, it's just kind of implied. I can spell it out, but that's how we handle things today with sidecars. So I just didn't call out the fact that this would work for non-Kubernetes workloads because Istio just makes that a blanket statement, kind of. But if you think it's important, I'm happy to put some updates on that, Sanjeev.
Okay, I'll just put a comment on the doc, and you can at least, yeah.
But it's not. We should not say non-Kubernetes. Even Kubernetes multi-cluster network policy, Kubernetes network policy doesn't really work always because the network policy is inside the cluster. So we already don't support. Maybe we should make it explicit in the docs that Kubernetes policy it's only specific to that cluster, and we, it may or may not work. It's not our problem. But does not, mislead users into believing it's specific to VMs. It's also for multi-cluster Kubernetes.
Yeah. Again, maybe we're rattling, but there's quite a bit here on this topic, and in fact, we had sort of initiated some work around multi-cluster Kubernetes network policy, which kind of got put on the back burner. But yeah, I'll probably just add some. I'll just review Louis' document and add any comments.
Yeah, just to be clear, my doc is pretty narrowly focused on, what is the status schema going to be when the policy is banned in specific contexts? What are our upgrade recommendations around ambient, and I might even just break those parts out. Yeah, so the doc is very much a work in progress, but there's enough detail there on the status for people to review, I think. But there are definitely some open design questions in the doc too.
Louis, to confirm, the conclusion is that if Kubernetes Gateway defines some authorization policy upstream, we will have as a priority to implement it and support.
I would say it's very likely. Unless the Istio community thought that API was bad, we would almost certainly support it.
Well, in order to become an API, it will need 2 implementations, and we are probably going to be involved in the definition.
Right? Yeah. It's very unlikely that we would. And I know Mike here is doing some thinking about that, but I don't know if there's anything concrete written down yet as a proposal. But hopefully it will come up.
There is not yet.
Yeah.
Please keep
Okay.
me in the loop.
But yeah, also definitely interested in working with you, Costin, if you have ideas about like what you want to see in that and structures that might be amenable to Istio's needs as well.
Well, it kind of has to be. We are one of the implementers.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, so there's right now the current state is there's this policy status document which needs some review. There's the traffic capture document, which I need to go back to. There is the conformance document, which I have not had any time to go and look at. And those are the 3 major outstanding documents. You could argue that there's also a sandwich document that's tied in, that would have a bearing on the conformance document, but probably not the other 2 documents. No, not the in-pod redirection. Like traffic capture here, I mean, Sanjeev, the deciding whether traffic for a specific service or a namespace or a workload should go through a waypoint or not. Yeah. These documents have all had a mutual bearing on each other, which is why it's taking a little time to work through them. But Auth-Z was probably the most thorny of those. There seems to be reasonable consensus on folks who read the waypoint capture document that the API structurally makes sense. So it's just mostly the document that needs to be tidying up, though there are some details about egress and some other things. And then the conformance document just hasn't had any love, but is thematically correct, but is just not in detail correct versus the other documents. Anyway, that is a lot, but it's good progress. So if you have time right now, if you have review bandwidth, focus your review on the policy status and traffic capture docs. The conformance one can come later, so it's not as much of a priority.
All right. Anything else to be added to this topic? Okay. If not, are there any other topics agenda folks like to discuss today? Sanjeev?
I have a bit of an open sort of question. Has anybody ever encountered an issue, a customer issue where the application itself, and I kind of posted this question on one of the Istio Slack channels, but since we have time, I might as well ask it here as well. Has anybody encountered issue where the customer is trying to run an application which itself is trying to create IP table rules inside the container, and those potentially can conflict with the redirection IP table rules that Istio CNI would add? Like, have we decided that those kinds of applications never need Istio to begin with, or we just have never tried it yet? Because if an application is trying to do its own IP table rules, those can sort of conflict with the redirection IP table rules.
Yeah, that's Lewis can probably talk about.
The short answer is vanishingly rare, Sanjeev. Right. Obviously, the ability to produce IP table rules requires some elevated privileges in the pod, which most systems and administrators don't want to grant to pods. I'm not going to say it never happens, but it's been so rare that it
With
hasn't been some,
sidecars. Yeah,
with
which would have the
sidecars,
same
right?
problem. Yeah.
That yeah, because if you could rewrite the IP tables rules and make traffic not go through sidecars, right? And that would annoy people who were trying to make traffic go through sidecars. So in general, this has not been something that Istio has felt the need to address. From a pure architectural purity standpoint, yes. Maybe at some point down the road, we'd like something that wouldn't even have this problem, but we haven't really seen this problem in production. And any customer who's had it has usually been amenable to some form of workaround. Costin,
Yeah.
I think you were next.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and probably something we should dive deeper into. It's not necessarily, I mean, it is a rare situation right now because people just use Istio, but the issue is not necessarily an accident, but a user using multiple mesh implementations or attempting to use Ambient and perhaps some different versions of Istio or some other frameworks that both of them, including other CNI plugins that may exist. It's going to be more and more a problem, for people who are trying to migrate from one mesh to another, or there are plenty of other reasons where you may have multiple CNIs or multiple sidecars or multiple technologies trying to fight over the same rules. And as a single application, just randomly setting some IP table because it's doing something special, if they have permissions, they should have the expertise to do whatever they need and should deal with it. I mean, it's not we may document the hooks we have or whatever to make it easier for them to work with us. But accidentally or people who are doing intentionally multiple CNIs because are migrating, it may hurt us or may hit us, and we probably should have a plan around it, what to do about it, or how to properly migrate from one implementation to another, or coexistence.
Yeah, I mean, this was one of the reasons why the CNI plugins tried to do minimal things inside container namespaces so that the container itself can be a network proxy and do its own IP tables, and the CNI can be outside.
Oh, it's the opposite, I'm afraid. I mean, it's really we have very good ways for Istio to limit which CNI plugins we interact with. The problem is that anything that happens in the host namespace, it's far worse because if a plugin is on by default, they will just blankly all pods will be affected, but Istio in particular is able to restrict its own impact. I'm more worried about host changes than pod changes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, systemically, right? Like there's in pod, there's on host, right? As the layer separation where you can do things. Like if you look at CNIs today, right, and on other systems, right, you've got like people trying to install 17 different eBPF hooks, and there's no guarantee that they don't collide with each other, right? Where you're trying to use one eBPF hook for traffic management, one for telemetry, one for security, right? And we've seen cases where they collide as well. And the same is true for in pod, right? So, right there's always the potential for conflicts, no matter which layer you choose to inject your behavior. I don't think, taking Istio's hooks out of the pod and putting them in the host is as risky as having them in pod, probably, if not worse.
Yeah.
Worse.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, from my experience, it's worse because each CNI implements redirection differently. Some do it with eBPF, some do it with IP routes, some do it with IP rules. It's really creative. So you kind of going to be fighting with many different implementations.
Yeah, I mean, completely agree that the import CNI is the right approach, or the best approach right now. But this was more of a generic question. In fact, even true for sidecar Istio, right? Since in a sidecar also we are adding these IP table rules, do we not come across applications where the application itself is a proxy or some kind of networking function like a firewall, and it wants to do its own IP table rules?
But especially something like a firewall, it would probably be in the host namespace, right?
No, if it's a containerized app, like the app itself is a networking function, right? Like,
well, yeah, but then usually what you see is that the capture functionality of that service is done in the host network namespace, and the thing running in the pod is just the runtime implementation of the policy system.
no, this is not a host level networking function. This is a network as a containerized app running inside the pods, doing its own IP tables, thinking that everything within this namespace is under my control. But there is also the infrastructure, Istio infrastructure, adding IP table rules, which can conflict.
Right, I'm just
It's
yeah,
telco kind of, yeah.
Right, so there's the VNFs, right, which Kubernetes has its own proposal for VNFs. Yes, you can have. They tend to mount themselves onto other dedicated networks, Sanjeev, when they do that, and not the Kubernetes host network or the Kubernetes cluster network.
True. Yeah.
So it tends to be very, very segmented, and then we tend not to interfere. Most of the VNF stuff I'm aware of for telco anyway, it all exists in this virtual network, right? That's got nothing to do with the pod network namespace. Because the telco network is so complicated, trying to express it within the confines of the Kubernetes network would make no sense.
Yeah, no, completely agree. I only brought it up because when we were discussing sort of this import thing inside of a company, some people said that in the past, putting IP table rules inside the container, some people have had concerns. And I just wanted to know whether anybody here has encountered telco type apps where the app itself is also trying to do IP tables. But it would appear that either those kinds of apps don't typically use service mesh, or you need to do some kind of manual coordination so that they can both insert IP table rules and consistently continue to work.
Yeah, the only specific one I'm aware of, and there was actually discussion with ONAP, and they actually recommended the use of Cilium for a secure overlay, and then they would run the virtualized telco network on top of that into the VNFs running in pods, but it didn't impose on the Kubernetes cluster network at all. It's actually in the ONAP spec to use Istio. I don't know if ONAP is still relevant in the industry or not, but that was one that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I think the telco people haven't quite started using service mesh, and maybe they never will for network-centric apps. But if they do, then this could be an issue where the app itself is also trying to set IP tables inside the container. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I mean that like just like they probably would have had a problem with host network IP tables to Like if you look at some of the older CNIs, they're probably still going to have some problems with that, no matter, like, leaving aside Istio, right? You're going to have some of those problems with CNIs as well. If there's a specific requirement, right, we can try and adapt to it. The one thing that we have tried to do is to offer a variety of traffic capture mechanisms for different environments that make sense. Like on VMs, we offer SOX proxy, for instance, as an alternate way to get traffic to go through the Z tunnel.
Well, to your point about they would have had problems with CNIs as well, actually probably not, because that's why CNIs typically don't touch inside the container namespace. They usually run outside, either in OVS or in host space. So CNIs usually, unless they're doing some fancy socket to socket mapping thing like Cilium does, they usually don't get inside the container namespace.
One thing I want to point out is that half or more than half of what we are providing in Ambient is actually the waypoints, and we are trying to make them independent of CNI. So regardless of what Z-tunnel is doing low level, you can swap it with another secure implementation, secure network. But most of the API and most of the things we are providing as value are actually living in the gateway implementation, which is, as long as it's independent of CNI, it doesn't really matter. So we should make sure we are isolated from this problem.
Yep. Sorry, don't mean to rat hole, but I think that's fine. Thanks.
All right. With that, are there any other agenda folks like to discuss? Okay. If not, then let's call the meeting adjourned. Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.